Welcome everyone to this session of the AI for Net Zero webinar series. I'm Sarah Perez. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Heriot-Watt University, and I will be your chair today, along with Daniel Williamson from the University of Exeter. The webinar series is designed to bring together experts, innovators, and enthusiasts from both artificial intelligence and sustainability domains, with an overarching goal to accelerate progress towards net zero targets. So we aim to engage and inform communities about groundbreaking research and developments at the intersection of AI and sustainability. And today webinars will explore these concerns from the perspective of human and social impact. So it's thus our pleasure to host Professor Lauren Wismarsh, who is an environmental psychologist specializing in perception and behavior in relation to climate change, energy, and transport. And she is based in the Department of Psychology at the University of Bath. She is director of the ESRC-funded UK Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, and she regularly advises governmental and other organizations on low carbon behavior changes and climate change communication. Our research projects have included studies of meat consumption, energy efficiency behaviors, waste reduction and carrier bag reuse, perception of smart technologies and electric vehicles, low carbon lifestyles, and responses to climate change. So today she will share with us insights into behavior change for net zero. So please join me in welcoming her. Feel free to engage anytime in the discussion by writing your questions in the YouTube chats. We will host a Q&A at the end of our talk. So Professor Wismarsh, thank you for being with us today. It's a great pleasure, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be with you. So yes, I'm going to be talking about behaviour change for net zero. This is probably an introduction that isn't needed for this audience, but of course the risks of climate change every day are becoming more apparent, not only in the developed world, in countries across Europe and North America, for example, but of course we know that in the developing world, these risks are even more profound, and their ability to adapt is less than it is in the developed world. So we are facing a climate emergency. And what do we do in the face of these existential risks? Well, it's quite typical that this sort of approach that I'm showing you here, which comes from the UK government's net zero strategy, their Build Back Better from 2021, and from the forward from the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, we see this quote that says, "For years, going green was inextricably bound up with a sense that we have to sacrifice the things that we love. But this strategy shows that we can build back greener without so much as a hair shirt in sight. In 2050, we will be driving cars, flying planes, heating our homes, but our cars will be electric, gliding silently around our cities. Our planes will be zero emission, allowing us to fly guilt-free," and so on. This is very typical of policy discourse around climate change, which is that technologies will provide the solutions and that people will not need to change, that there will not need to be any impact on our standards of living, our quality of life, and governments. Even more recently, we've heard Keir Starmer in the UK saying the government will not tread on people's lifestyles. They will not intervene. So this kind of discourse is very typical. But it doesn't actually align with the scientific evidence of what we need to do to tackle climate change. IPCC assessments repeatedly talk about the need for societal transformation, and assessments, including analysis from the UK's Climate Change Committee, have made clear that technological change by itself is not going to be enough to reach our net zero targets. It will be an important component, of course. We will need electric vehicles and sustainable aviation fuels and many other things besides. But without behaviour change, we're not going to be able to reach our targets. And they have attempted to quantify the amount of behaviour change needed to reach our net zero targets, and they estimate that about 62% of what we need to reach net zero will involve at least some degree of consumer behaviour change. Much of the rest of what's needed will involve change within businesses, communities, leaders, and so on. So a more professional, the more professional context, there will be behaviour change. So in that sense, you could say most of the things we need to reach our net zero targets will require people to change what they do in one form or another. And we know from many climate change committee assessments that we're not on track, that we are off where we should be. And furthermore, a couple of years ago, the House of Lords commissioned an inquiry on behaviour change for net zero and environmental goals, concluding that the government's approach to changing behaviour is seriously inadequate, not least because they tend to emphasise technological solutions and not try to change behaviour. The scale of behaviour change is also very profound, actually, that what's needed to reach net zero. There was a report a couple of years ago by the Hot or Cool Institute that quantified the reduction in average carbon footprint within the UK and in many other countries. And the UK carbon footprint at that time was about 8.5 tonnes. It's a little bit less now. But the report said that if we're to reach our net zero targets and to stay within 1.5 degrees of global warming, we need to reduce the average carbon footprint to 2.5 tonnes by the end of this decade, so within about 5 years. So that's a profound change from 8 or so tonnes to 2.5 tonnes in about 5 years. And these are the sorts of behaviour changes that we're talking about. This figure comes from work by Ivanova and colleagues, where they've quantified the emission reductions from various behaviour changes, and the numbers in the circles show the tonnes of CO2 saved by these different actions. So if you give up your car entirely, you'd save about 2 tonnes of carbon per year, which, remembering we're trying to get from 8 tonnes to 2.5 tonnes, that would take a big chunk out. And you see the rest cover a range of travel behaviours, energy behaviours, and even dietary behaviours make it in there as well. So, for example, moving to a plant-based diet. Now, for context, I've put on the right-hand side the amount of CO2 savings that could be achieved through recycling as much as is possible to recycle over the course of a year, and that's 0.01 tonnes. So orders of magnitude less effective than, say, not driving. And yet it is exactly what the public tends to think is one of the most effective things they can do to tackle climate change. So there's a big misperception in what behaviours need to change and how effective different behavioural changes would be. Now, of course, those figures I've just shown you are averages, the average carbon footprint. But of course, beneath that average, there is a huge variety of lifestyles, and not all households have the same size of carbon footprint, or indeed the ability to change their behaviours may also vary substantially. The biggest predictor of carbon footprint size is income. So people on the top income have, the wealthiest 10% specifically, have a carbon footprint more than 4 times that of people at the bottom end of the income spectrum. In the US, incidentally, it's 16 times more, so that disparity is even greater. So we're talking about very big differences between the wealthiest and the poorest in society. So the wealthiest do have to change more, they have a bigger carbon footprint. But of course, people's ability to change will depend on where they live, their demographic characteristics, their income, and a range of other factors. So it's important to bear that in mind when we're talking about how to change behaviour, is those sorts of approaches to change behaviour will need to be adapted to the specific context that people live in. And of course, the same goes for thinking about this across different countries. I've just shown the figures for the UK there. You see that 8.5 tonne figure is the average carbon footprint in the UK. But even bigger than that is Canada, and the USA is similar. So they have about a 14 tonne carbon footprint. But of course, countries like Indonesia have a much, much smaller carbon footprint, 2 0.2 tonnes. So they actually have some capacity to slightly increase their carbon footprint if they were to have an equitable carbon footprint of other countries by 2030, if we all had a 2.5 tonne carbon footprint. So it's worth, again, thinking about the sort of disparity in the size of carbon footprint, the amount of behaviour that needs to change, whose behaviour needs to change. But it's also important, I guess, to reflect on who we are as well. So what I've shown so far really are the things that we can do to reduce our direct CO2 emissions, our own carbon footprint, for example, by changing how we use energy or how we travel. But we're not only consumers in that sense, we are also citizens, so we can vote and protest and call for climate policies by the government. We can invest our money in green products and services, in financial products and services. We're role models, actually. So this is maybe a role that we don't necessarily think of so often, but actually for those people around us, our friends, family, the people that maybe we go to football matches with or we share other interests with, every time we take a particular action, whether that's cycling to work or choosing a veggie burger, that sends an implicit signal that this is something that we think is important, that's a good idea to do. So we can role model low carbon behaviours or even just have a conversation with other people about climate action in our day-to-day lives. And the final role is organisational participant. In other words, particularly in the workplace, as professionals, there's plenty that we can do, actually, whether it's calling for our employer to take action or within the decisions that we can take directly at work, whether that be thinking about supply chains or the sorts of research maybe we're doing if we're researchers. These are all things that we potentially have some a choice over and can do that may have some impact on climate change. And so these roles towards the right-hand side are all sort of ways in which we can maybe indirectly reduce carbon emissions because we can engage in system change or social change or organisational change in some small way. And part of the reason I want to flag that is because when I talk about behaviour change, often people will naturally think about how difficult it is to change their behaviour or people's behaviour in general. They'll say, that's fine, but how do we give up our car? If that's the single best thing that we can do to tackle climate change, how can I really do that when the system is not there to support that sort of choice? Well, another way to reframe that is to say, well, we actually have lots of other roles that we can play, as I've just shown, and one of those roles is as a role model, and that we can actually just have a conversation. Now, that's important because of something called pluralistic ignorance. So we know from now a number of studies that people, the public, tend to consistently underestimate the amount of climate change concern and support for climate policy that exists amongst the wider public. So an example is shown just here on the left from some work by Andre et al. Published in Nature Climate Change fairly recently, where they did a big global poll of the public and asked the public whether they would be willing to contribute 1% of their income to tackle climate change. They found that 69% on average would contribute 1%. But when they also asked these people, what percentage of the general public do you think would contribute 1%? They estimated on average 43%. So that's substantially lower than the actual amount of people willing to change to contribute their income. And we've seen this now across a number of studies that people generally don't think that other people are very worried about climate change or very willing to take action. And the reason that that's potentially problematic is because if you think you're really sort of on your own, you're not likely to then want to have a conversation about climate change, to talk about climate change, to voice your concerns, maybe to act on those concerns because you feel you're in the minority, you feel inhibited, you don't want to speak out about something that you think most people are actually not worried about, which then reinforces this kind of silence around climate change that people generally don't talk about it. This has led Katharine Hayhoe, who's a famous climate scientist, in her TED talk to say the single most important thing you can do to fight climate change is to talk about it. So she says whether or not you're able to reduce your own carbon footprint, great if you can. But even if you do nothing else, have a conversation, because then you can start to change the social norm around actually worrying about climate change and build a broader kind of level of a public mandate really for action. And she talks about how you can do that. You can find common ground with your audience, talk about the solutions that you know are good for us. But just going back to that poll that I just mentioned, that big global poll, which found that most people are willing to contribute 1%. In the UK, the figures I've just got on the left here are from the UK alone. So we see slightly under half say they're willing to donate 1% to tackle climate change. But much higher levels are worried about climate change, think that the UK should fight it, also say that the UK government is not doing enough. So in a sense, the public is actually quite engaged with climate change. There is a norm really to be worried about it and to feel like we should be doing more. And actually, if you look at who is particularly worried, young people are amongst the most worried, up to 45% actually saying that it's impacting on their day-to-day functioning, their ability to sleep, to concentrate at school, to feel okay, basically. So they express some level of eco-anxiety. And what studies have shown as well is that actually that eco-anxiety is directly linked to a perceived failure by governments to act on climate change. So this sense that actually leaders are failing to take action, and that's impacting on their sense of their well-being, that they feel more distressed because they themselves don't have the power to do so much and they feel let down by leaders. So against this backdrop of growing public concern and a desire to do more, what can governments do to support people to change their behaviour? Because we know at the moment actually people are not doing as much as they could. There are two broad strategies that governments or other actors can take to change behaviour. Downstream is where the focus is on influencing individuals' choices directly. This is often informational approaches, so it could be labelling or a campaign or an educational intervention or a kind of social influence approach. The other approach is upstream, where you're trying to influence the context in which people are acting, the situation. So this might include economic measures to make low carbon options cheaper or high carbon options more expensive, changing the availability of products and services. That might be nudging to make low carbon options just more visible on the shelves, or it might be actually regulating to remove the highest carbon options. It might also involve physical infrastructural changes or changes to the built environment to enable people to make low carbon choices. And if we look at the evidence on the relative efficacy of these different approaches, it's always quite striking just how ineffective downstream approaches by themselves are. A meta-analysis by Neisser et al. Found that on average, information alone is only 2 to 3% effective in changing behaviour. Studies also particularly from the health policy domain show that relying on information by itself can exacerbate inequalities because it doesn't remove the barriers to behaviour change. So for those on the lowest income, for example, it doesn't make it easier or cheaper to choose greener or healthier products, but actually it just informs people, but it doesn't actually enable them to make choices. Whereas upstream measures remove barriers to behaviour change. They actually make it cheaper, more available, easier to do the right thing. But I think it's worth saying that downstream is important in the sense that giving people information about climate change and about low carbon choices is important in order to build public support for upstream measures. So it's to say, we do need downstream actually, but we can't rely on it to work to change behaviour by itself. What it does do is help build support for wider social change, and particularly these upstream approaches, which are better at changing behaviour. And downstream is also important because we know there are particular information gaps or knowledge gaps amongst the public. I mentioned one of them earlier, which is that people tend to vastly overestimate how effective recycling is relative to how it actually how good it actually is to reduce emissions. From some work we did a few years ago across a number of countries, we also asked about, well, a range of different behaviours, and you see 4 examples here, and we asked how much impact the public felt that these different actions had on the environment in terms of reducing environmental impact. And you can see that the most widely, or the most highest rated behaviour was turning off the tap when brushing the teeth, that people across all of these very diverse countries thought that that was the most effective thing that they could do to reduce their environmental impact. Whereas things like reducing consumption, avoiding eating meat, even contacting a politician, they tended to rate much less, as being much less impactful. So there are consistent knowledge gaps that we find, that we still find in this sense, that people tend to underestimate the impact, particularly of things like dietary choices. We see that still cropping up. Another finding from the evidence on giving people information is that sometimes it can actually have polarizing effects. We, in one study, we gave a group of members of the public, half of which we'd identified as being relatively skeptical about climate change. They were sort of deniers, really. And the other half were more concerned about climate change. And everybody read 2 newspaper articles that were about climate change. One of them presented a relatively skeptical perspective, and one of them advocated for taking ambitious climate change action. And we asked everybody who had read these 2 articles, did you become more or less convinced about climate change having read these 2 articles? And the people that were not skeptical about climate change said they'd become slightly more convinced. The skeptics, on the other hand, said they'd become much less convinced about climate change. And it's to reinforce they read the same information, but they came away with different perspectives on climate change, basically reinforcing their existing views to an extent. So giving people information doesn't necessarily have the effect that we would want it to. And the reason for that is because our perceptions of climate change tend to be filtered through various cognitive and emotional biases. So heuristics like, does this align with what I already believe? So confirmation bias is the one that we were particularly interested in that study just now, that people consistently select information that reinforces what they already believe, and they assimilate that information, and they just sort of ignore information that tends to conflict with what they believe. But trust and the way in which information is framed, all those things will also affect whether people accept and use information. As a result of this, it's difficult to actually give people information and to persuade them to change their mind. Now, one thing we do know is more effective to communicate anything is to understand what your audience values, what their beliefs are, what they're concerned about, and then to tailor the message accordingly. So if you can actually align your message to what your audience knows and believes, they're more likely to accept it. Now, as it happens, lots of the things that we can do to tackle climate change do actually have wider benefits for people. Changing diet is a really good example because there are some very clear health benefits of reducing the amount of red and processed meat that we eat. Now, if I was in a room with you, I might ask you to put up your hand to see whether you would predict that giving members of the public information about the health benefits of reducing meat consumption would be more effective than talking about the environmental benefits. And we hypothesized that talking about the health benefits would, because generally people are a bit more interested in their health than in the environment. But in the study, we actually found that both messages were effective in reducing red and processed meat consumption. And by the way, on the left, you see an example of the messages that we gave people. It was on a chatbot over a couple of weeks. And we tracked their meat consumption through food diaries over the course of the 2 weeks, and then a month after the intervention. And what I didn't tell you at the beginning of this slide is that as well as having a condition where we just talked about the health benefits and one where we just talked about the environmental benefits, we did also have a combined condition where we talked about both. And that's the example you see there. And what we found actually was the combined condition was the one that was a little bit more effective actually than the other two, where we talked about separate benefits, which kind of leads us to think, well, actually, the more we can talk about multiple benefits of climate action, the more we're likely to be able to engage diverse audiences, because it will resonate hopefully with their values more. And the good news is that actually most of the actions we can take do have multiple co-benefits. This figure that you are not supposed to be able to see the detail of, but simply the colours, comes from IPCC Assessment Report 6 work that Felix Kreutzig and colleagues did, where they actually mapped the various co-benefits for the Sustainable Development Goals of climate mitigation actions. So along the in the first column, you see all the various climate mitigation actions, from shared mobility to compact cities to energy efficiency and so on. And then along the top are the various SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. So things that can improve well-being in lots of different ways in terms of health and equity and social cohesion and so on. And the bluer colours are where there are high positive impacts, and the orangest colours are the strongest negative impacts. And you can basically see that there's lots of blue. So there's basically lots of co-benefits from taking climate action. And actually health co-benefits are amongst the most well evidenced. And it isn't just about our physical health, it is also about our mental health. So we have also found that people that have greener lifestyles tend to, on average, report higher subjective well-being. And that's across quite diverse cultures, and it controls for income and lots of other things too. And there's now quite a substantial evidence base showing that there are well-being benefits from lots of pro-environmental actions. And this then, again, it sort of serves to undermine the assumption that was, I think, really almost explicit in Boris Johnson's forward to the net zero strategy, which is that going green was about sacrifice. Actually, going green isn't necessarily about sacrifice. In fact, it can improve quality of life substantially. That's important because actually, if you talk to people about what is important about them, it's all of these sorts of co-benefits that I've just shown you. It is about having green space and healthy lifestyles and having more time to spend with family and community and so on. And this comes out of some work, for example, that we've done across various different cities around the world now with the public, where we've explored desirable low carbon futures, and it's clear that people actually are really excited about these tangible benefits to health, well-being and community that are really clearly mapped out by the IPCC. So what we can do then is use these insights in the way we communicate with people. We can actually talk about how low carbon actions are desirable in quite tangible ways to people. So we've just done this quite recently with some work with Scottish Government, where we interviewed members of the public and did some surveys to try to talk about car use in particular. And we talked to people that were starting to reduce their car use, and we talked about how they did that and why. And we really found that there were some the positives that they talked about were health benefits, well-being benefits, being able to spend time with family, getting to know their local area, their community more, reducing loneliness. So these kind of things then we used to create so-called pen portraits, these kind of little stories about characters who were reducing their car use, and we talked about the way they'd done that. So we emphasised how possible it is for diverse people. So we had these 6 kind of characters or couples in a couple of cases who were reducing their car use. For example, Alex, a young adult living in an urban area, the steps that person had taken and the tangible benefits they'd experienced. And the idea here was to really make climate actions seem normal, desirable, and achievable. And when we tested these with audiences that were similar to, that had sort of shared characteristics with the person in the story, we found that they did rate them as being relevant, as being motivational, and so on. So these stories, this way of communicating, actually is quite effective. One final thing on communication is that it also matters when we intervene, because we know that a lot of the time habits are a big barrier to lifestyle change. We're often on autopilot, actually, day to day. We're not consciously thinking about what we're doing. When we go to work in the morning, we're not going to weigh up our options of how to get there. We will just take the same form of travel that we always do. But there are times at which habits are disrupted or weakened, and we call those moments of change. And that a really obvious and well-studied one is moving house. So once you've moved house, you will then have to think, how am I going to get to work? How am I going to get to the shops? Where am I going to buy things? And you will become much more conscious in your decision-making. And at that moment at which you're moving out of a habitual mindset into a more deliberative mindset, an intervention, in this case, some information about their local bus service and a one-day pass to try the bus for free, is going to be much more effective, because you're going to be much more open to changing and trying new behaviours. And that's what they found here was in this study, when they gave that intervention to people that had recently moved house, they found that bus use over doubled amongst that group compared to the group who had not recently moved house and therefore had much just stronger travel habits that were harder to disrupt, and the intervention didn't work for them. There was no significant increase in bus use for that group. So it matters when we intervene as well. But just to really reiterate this point about the limits of information, this is some embarrassing work that we did a couple of years ago, where we compared climate scientists with scientists that study anything else, and basically found that people that study climate change or sustainability actually fly more often for work than other types of scientists or researchers. And actually both groups took similar amounts of personal flights. Perhaps most damning of all, flying increased with seniority. So we found that the group that had the biggest carbon footprint from flying were climate change professors. So you could say some of the people on the planet that have maybe the most information, the most knowledge about climate change, are those who, at least for work, are doing the most flying, which hopefully at least is just an example of the limits of information and the limits of knowledge. Knowledge by itself doesn't lead to behaviour change. And I'm happy to talk about why we maybe found those relationships, but just as a way to illustrate that. In that case, if information and increasing people's knowledge about climate change is not enough to change behaviour, what do we need to do? It's back to the idea of upstream interventions. We need to change the context in which people are acting. So we can do that through nudging, for example. Nudging is really where you're trying to change the choice architecture. You're just trying to make it easy for people to do the right thing, but without actually completely removing options. So it's not about banning or regulating. It's just about reducing the frictions to behaviour change. And an example that I like is a study in Cambridge where they increased the proportion of vegetarian options on menus. Previously, it had been 1 in 4 of the choices. They changed it to 2 in 4 of the choices. And that very small change increased plant-based sales by up to 80%. Moving people onto a renewable energy tariff increased adoption of renewable energy as a default. So they were moved as a default onto the green tariff versus having to opt in to have green energy. That increased uptake from 3% to 90%. Now, nudging is great in certain contexts, but we can't apply it everywhere. So transport is a nice example of where nudging is not quite so applicable. And here, what studies have shown is that congestion charging or low emission zones are one of the most effective ways we can reduce car use. So in London, the congestion charge there has reduced car use by 33%. And changing infrastructure is another example where we can actually just redesign cities and buildings to actually make it easier and, again, sort of the norm, the default for people to do the right thing, according to the environment at least. So we can reallocate road space away from cars and give them to cyclists, pedestrians, public transport, for example, and that's significantly reduced car use as well. So these are all things which don't get people to think differently necessarily. They are about changing the context, making it easier, cheaper, more natural to do the right thing. And actually, if you ask people about whether they would support a lot of these sort of upstream type measures, we find that broadly speaking, the public are in favour of most of these sorts of measures. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we have worked with Ipsos Mori, the polling company, to survey the UK public. And this is a very big survey, so they have a sample of over 5,500 people, and they give these people information about lots of different net zero policies that imply behaviour change. So I've just shown you the kind of the title of the behaviour of the policy, but for each of them, participants they're told what that would involve. So frequent flyer levies is where for each flight that you take, you would pay relatively more tax. So for the first flight, you might pay little or no tax. If it's your 10th flight, you would pay an awful lot of tax. And in here, the sort of polluter pays principle is sort of embedded, and we see that actually that's the most popular of the policies presented. But even higher taxes on red meat and dairy, there is actually more support than there is opposition, interestingly. I'm conscious of time. It's just worth saying, I think, just before I finish, that actually, while that we have also done work to understand why the public do or do not support policies. And what we find, and I won't go into all of the detail of this very busy table, but the single biggest predictor of policy support is perceived fairness of the policy. So the reason that we see frequent flyer levies being popular is because we know that it's only the richest that can take many flights a year. And of course, those people are doing the most pollution, so it makes sense that they should pay relatively more for that pollution in tax. Where there is less choice over our behaviours, we know that people see that as less fair. Where there are groups that are disproportionately affected, people see that as less fair, and therefore those policies are less accepted. So fairness turns out to be actually incredibly important to building support for public for climate policies. And part of that fairness is about actually giving people a say in developing the policies. So it's not only about distributional fairness, about kind of winners and losers in terms of the policy implementation, but in terms of actually participatory and procedural forms of justice, actually giving people a say. And just to give you one example of that, I was involved in the Climate Assembly UK a few years ago, which was the first UK citizen assembly on climate change, which brought together over 100 members of the public, completely representative, a kind of microcosm of the UK in terms of demographics, geography, even levels of climate concern. And we asked people we spent 6 weekends with those people. They were learning about climate change, about different policies to reach net zero, and they were charged with coming up with conclusions and recommendations for the UK government on how they should reach net zero by 2050 across whole range of different areas of policy. And what came out of that was a huge report showing that actually the public, these informed members of the public, were very supportive of ambitious climate policies. And also importantly, it showed why and why not, which policies were supported and which were not. And fairness, again, was really important for people. So was co-benefits, this idea of there should be win-wins. It should be good for us in other ways, our well-being and the local high street and so on, that we should give people, retain freedom and choice where possible, that people should have more information, and that there should be strong leadership from government. So I'll just wrap up and say, it's clear that technological change by itself is not going to be enough. We do need very significant behaviour change to tackle climate change, but also there are clear benefits to individuals and society in terms of well-being by making those changes. In order to achieve those very significant behaviour changes, we need the public to play an active role in decision making about how to reach net zero. So we do need a public participation strategy. We need governments to remove the barriers to behaviour change that are very significant, the cost and convenience barriers. So we need more upstream measures. And because we know people have multiple roles, they're not only consumers. So this is not only about the rollout of electric vehicles and heat pumps, that's part of it. But we also know that people's lifestyles will have to change more widely, and that as citizens, they can play a role, as professionals, as investors. And so there's plenty that people can do in their day-to-day lives across those different roles. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lorraine, for a fascinating talk, a real tour de force across lots and lots and lots of exciting research. So I'm going to host a Q&A, as you can see in the main screen there. Please do add any questions you have into your chat, and I'll be able to pose them to Lorraine. Sarah, if you don't have a question, I will kick us off.
Yeah, you can start. I have a question as well, but please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I was interested in all of it, but I was struck by your policy support study that kind of showed, of a collection of policies, there was kind of support for them. A lot of the seminars we've seen in this webinar series, AI for Net Zero, are sort of trying to help, whether it's users or policymakers of some kind, make decisions to maybe reduce carbon in some optimal way, or spend a given budget in order to deliver something to net zero. How could those types of AI systems make use of the many types of research you've done to kind of, I don't want to say optimize because I don't like optimize, but figure out net zero solutions that actually have public support, but will actually bring a lot of public engagement, but still acknowledge that there's kind of like a finite budget across all of these government departments, and just because a particular thing is supported, it doesn't mean that people will uptake that policy and it will actually have a big change once it's invoked. And I'm more thinking about would the air subsidy, the tax that you mentioned, sure, people support it, but would the rich people just pay more anyway, and it wouldn't actually have any impact because it wouldn't reduce the number of flights? So how do we sort of balance that? Well, people like it, but also it will help net zero.
Yes, I think there are a few elements to your question, so I hope I'll be able to answer it. But I guess in terms of the sort of how do we get the balance right between, well, first of all, how do we ensure policies are effective? And yes, just because something is acceptable and popular doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective. So we do need to balance public acceptability, I think, with effectiveness. And that's, I think, the sort of the balancing act that policymakers are really looking for, is where is the optimal overlap? So I don't know if there is an AI kind of way in which you can, if you can use sort of AI tools to really try to optimize public acceptability as an input. I mean, there's work that colleagues are doing to try to get social evidence, including acceptability, but also behaviour change, better represented within, say, climate models and so on. So there may be ways in which AI can support that. But I think we know that those sorts of policies which make it less attractive to pollute, so a frequent flyer levy, by themselves are not going to be as effective as when they're combined with a carrot. So that's a sort of stick. You make it more expensive to fly, that's the stick. But the carrot that goes with it should be cheaper train travel. and more attractive and easier train travel, so that the sustainable option is better and the unsustainable option is worse, so that you systematically kind of tip the balance. So, and actually then that increases acceptability, because we know that that's seen as fairer, basically, because you're not just making it really difficult for people to do one thing, you are actually enabling them to do it in a better way. So I think there's something there, as well as just, I think what you sort of also said was about kind of more generally AI and public acceptability. And I think for any of these policies, we know that engagement is critical. Where there's been significant public backlash from policies like the ULEZ in Uxbridge, the ultra low emission zone, low traffic neighbourhoods in Oxfordshire and various other places. So quite a lot of that local backlash has been because those communities feel that these policies have been imposed on them without sufficient engagement and without listening to the concerns that they might have. And some of those are very valid concerns. So I think it is important for any policy, and in this, I think probably goes for sort of AI as well, where there would be ethical concerns, you know, bringing in, ensuring that engagement is embedded right from the outset, so that those policies and the implementation of those technologies are taking account of public concerns.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Sarah, you had a question.
Yeah. I'd actually a follow-up question on these discussions. So you talk about confirmation bias, and I'm wondering, how do you think these influence individual visions of what would be a low carbon society? And do you think it could have an impact on more global perspectives, like influencing the upstream measures and policy we may put in practice?
It's an interesting challenge. Yes, I mean, I think confirmation bias and the many heuristics and biases that guide our perceptions will always be underpinning our preferences for the future, our visions of what we want from a low carbon society. And so there will be sort of different perspectives people have. And so it's certainly the case that in these public workshops we've done, these visioning workshops, we've not found everybody has the same vision. There is that sort of heterogeneity that is based on kind of people's different sort of past experiences and their values and so on. But we also find quite a surprising degree of sort of agreement about certain elements. Like there really is a lot of valuing of green space, for example, of having kind of supportive communities, of, you know, clean air. I mean, these are things that kind of, it's quite difficult, I guess, to disagree with having a safe, clean environment. And so the more we can achieve these really tangible things, which aligns with most people's kind of preferences, I think we can sort of overcome what might otherwise be quite polarizing. Like, yes, I'd love to have a really equal society and all the rich pay tons of tax and so on. But that's obviously a bit more divisive and difficult to sort of get agreement on. But actually, if we focus on the things that people do have in common, I think then there's potential to move forward.
All right. So you're rather targeting like a common vision of a low carbon society rather than fitting every individual's wills. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, to some extent. I mean, we also, because we did these over lots of different locations in the UK and in other countries, we found that different places also emphasise different sorts of visions of the future. So in as far as you can create a future that might differ across places, you know, having a more place-based approach would be ideal. So yes, if you know, an old market town versus a newer city or something might have quite a different sort of development pathway, and different sets of preferences amongst those citizens. So I think it is about adapting to the context where possible, but within those groups, if you can find commonality, I think that's important.
Okay.
So we have a question from online.
Yeah. And I think it's a perfect introduction for the question from Hamid. So please, Danny.
Yes, okay.
Go ahead.
How do you approach tailoring behavior change interventions to different demographics?
Thank you for that. Yes, it is a good follow-up. That is quite a challenge in a way, because it's become sort of quite I guess fashionable or popular to sort of segment the public. And so segmentation tools try to disaggregate a population into, say, you know, 7 or 8 different subgroups, and you can obviously carve them up in different ways. It might be according to their values or their demographics or their other contextual factors. But the idea there is to recognise this diversity in the public and to say, well, there might be different levers needed for, say, this richer group to change their behaviour than this sort of low income group or something, or this rural versus urban group. And that, so in those cases, if you can identify populations where levers or interventions can be aligned to and targeted to those groups, they're more likely to be effective. And so urban rural is a good one. Like, you just wouldn't have the same transport solution to encourage reduced car use in an urban and a rural context. You'd need to take account of the available infrastructure and so on. In some cases, demographic groups kind of age, it may not always be possible to sort of disentangle where are these groups. So it sometimes having a segmentation model doesn't always lend itself to identifying where to intervene. But that's why I think the most effective intervention segmentation models are those which identify specific barriers to behaviour change amongst different groups. So it may be, you know, a lack of public transport in your area, or the cost of public transport or something. So yeah, I think that's a really good challenge, because it isn't always possible to identify those groups.
I have another question. It's a slight change of pace potentially. You presented wonderful studies from perhaps a decade and a half of research on engaging with the publics and attitudes and so on. Has the rise of misinformation, and particularly since COVID and recent events on social media and so on, is that moving the goalposts for this particular field in any way? And do you have a feeling for where it's going?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And I mean, I think there is sort of both significant potential, but also risks associated with kind of social media and online engagement, and the kind of the echo chamber that we see when people engage on social media, that it's really playing into this confirmation bias. So you just are always going to be listening to and seeking out information from like-minded people and reinforcing your views. So the polarization potential is much greater in an online context. But as you say, also the potential for misinformation to spread rapidly. But I think it is also important, I suppose, to flip that. And one of the things we're interested in actually is using computational social science tools to be able to say, how can we track the spread of low carbon norms and discourses? How can we see how low carbon behavior might be influenced through, say, social media? So I think there's some quite exciting innovations in that space, where we can potentially look at how misinformation spreads, who are the key sort of nodes of spreading that information, and what are the ways in which information takes hold, but equally look at it from a positive perspective, and how could we reach a social tipping point through the spread of more constructive narratives.
So kind of using their tools against them in some sense. Interesting. Sarah, do you have any further questions?
Yeah, I would have, definitely. So regarding your comments about knowledge and that it doesn't necessarily lead to behavior changes, what do you think are the key psychological barriers that would prevent individuals from adopting low carbon behaviors if they are properly aware of the situation and what they can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's been some interesting work in Canada, for example, tracking the sort of psychological barriers to action on climate change. And yeah, as you say, apart from just not necessarily knowing what's the most effective thing you can do, there are things like kind of temporal discounting, that we tend to just not think about the future so much. We're kind of focused on the here and now. We've already talked about kind of confirmation bias and some of those things. For me, I think the really bigger barriers are around more sort of contextual factors, like the cost and convenience of low carbon alternatives. So that's why I would sort of tend to say there is a role for those kind of more, I guess you could say, psychological approaches, but the really big sort of impact is going to be more in terms of kind of economic, regulatory sorts of interventions. That's where we're going to really see much more system change.
Yeah, fair enough. So we have a question from Ahmed again. So is asking, what is your perspective on the use of A/B testing, where different groups are exposed to varied interventions to assess their effectiveness in the context of promoting sustainable behaviors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, in fact, this is really where we need to be moving more towards, because we have sort of a growing evidence base of how interventions work theoretically and in the lab. And we do sort of lots of correlational studies, and we have self-reports of what people do and why they think they do it, and that huge gaps in our evidence in terms of actual field experiments about what works. I mean, there is some evidence there, but that's really where I think we need to be accelerating the evidence is in testing in field studies how interventions work amongst different groups as well, as you say in the question, really recognizing that for one group or in one situation it might be quite effective to increase the price of something, but in another group maybe it doesn't have so much effect. So we need to really be testing our interventions in this much more rigorous experimental approach.
All right, thank you very much for this comment. So we don't have any more questions from the audience, so I think we can wrap up here. Thank you again, Lorraine, for this very insightful talk, very different from what we are used to, but again, very useful and valuable things to have on our YouTube channel, I guess. Thanks everyone for watching the session today. Stay tuned. Next week we will have two young early career researchers from different universities involved in the project. So we will advertise this on our usual social medias like LinkedIn and YouTube. So stay tuned and hope to see you there.